Good evening. Today is Thursday, January the 27th, 2022. The time is now 6:30 p.m. and I will call the regular meeting of the ISD 191 Board of Education to order. So I'd like to first welcome everybody here today and also welcome Aiden Spencer, who is sitting in for Zoe Olson for our student rep tonight. Director Saeed, would you lead us in the pledge?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do I have a motion to approve the agenda tonight?
So moved.
Moved by Director Miller,
Second.
second by Director Werb. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. We'll start our meeting tonight with our committee of the whole, which is regarding student performance and achievement and the world's best workforce for kindergarten readiness. And tonight we will have Carolyn Cherry, Early Learning Supervisor, and Amina Oftedal, Director of Curriculum and Instruction and Assessment.
Good evening, Chair Chester, Assistant Superintendent Gersich, members of the board. At previous meetings, I was able to share an overview of all of the world's best workforce goals and results. And tonight, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to look more closely at one goal, which is all students ready for kindergarten. In this presentation, we'll share information regarding the programming available to families for children before they join a kindergarten classroom. Joining me this evening is Dr. Carolyn Cherry. Dr. Cherry is new to the 191 team and leads us in early learning.
Good evening. Good evening, Chair Chester, Assistant Superintendent Gersich, and members of the board. As Amina shared, my name is Carolyn Cherry, and I am the new Early Learning Supervisor in 191. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight to talk with you and share with you about an overview of our early learning programs. Information we want to share with you tonight includes data around our voluntary pre-K programs, an assessment tool we use to monitor progress and plan instruction, as well as the impact of the pandemic has had on our early learning programs. So before we jump in, one important piece is that we know that children are always learning and all children are ready to begin school. To support all students, it is essential that adults work together to establish equitable systems. As our early learning partners at the Minnesota Department of Education remind us, it is not the job of children to be ready for school, but for the responsibility of adults, programs, and systems to be ready to support each child. This evening's focus will be around ready schools and programs. So in early learning services, we coordinate across programs in both community and special education. As our district's new early learning supervisor, it is my responsibility to work with our leaders and teams to implement, support, and manage, facilitate, and coordinate services across 10 programs. There are over 110 staff across these programs in community and special education serving our youngest learners, their families, and caregivers. In broad strokes, these staff include teachers, parent educators, related service staff, educational assistants, program assistants, cultural liaisons, administrative and clerical staff. So you may wonder, what are those 10 programs? So shown here on this slide, the programs span early learning services, including screening, home, program, and school-based services for children from birth to age 5. The blue circles are programs in special education, and the green circles in community education. The number of children in each circle reflect those served in programs as of January 2022, with the exception of screening and early childhood special education evaluation teams. Those numbers are the total numbers of children and families that were served in the 2021 school year. And please note that not all children who come to the evaluation teams receive a full evaluation, but the team is required to make initial contact to make sure if there's a referral or some other service that needs to take place. Now, the next two slides may bring up more questions than answers, but we wanted to share with you some initial information regarding our voluntary pre-K programs. Our program leaders were interested in knowing how many children who attend our voluntary pre-K programs enroll in kindergarten the following year. What we learned from comparing the voluntary pre-K programs in the 2021 school year and that enrollment, looking at this year's enrollment for kindergarten, that about 75% of our students in VPK enrolled last year started kindergarten this year. Students who qualified for free and reduced lunch or were receiving special education services enrolled in kindergarten at slightly higher rates than the total group. And you can see the numbers there. On the next slide, when we look at the rates for student race or ethnicity, it's about the same compared to the total, and on average, about 75% of students enrolled in kindergarten this year. The fewest who returned are students who are white, and the students who returned the most were Hispanic. At this time, we do not know the specific whys for why some families choose to not enroll in kindergarten. However, we can look further into the data to determine where they go and consider gathering additional information from families. So now Amina is going to talk about the world's best workforce data.
As I said before, I have shared all of the 5 world's best workforce goals prior. However, I wanted to focus on this kindergarten data. The world's best workforce goal around early learning is a pre-literacy goal, and the letter name fluency is an indicator in the fall for incoming kindergartners. It is a limited indicator, but it does allow us that meaningful marker for students with their letter name fluency. Last year, the district did not meet the target of increasing the letter name fluency benchmark for the incoming kindergartners. We were hoping for an increase to 51%. However, with circumstances the way that they were, we only really were able to see 35 or 36% of our students meeting that benchmark. However, this single benchmark, and we've talked about this before, does not shine a light on the whole child. And Dr. Cherry and the early learning team, you are using additional tools that really help give a broad view of the growth and development of the whole child beyond just an early literacy indicator. Cherry?
So the tool that Amina is referring to is called Teaching Strategies Gold, and it is a formative assessment for children ages birth to 3rd grade. Teachers collect evidence in the natural environments in their classrooms, and it helps teachers understand child's progress, plan instruction, and supporting growth and development. There are 10 domains in this assessment, 4 that are developmental, 5 that are content, and 1 for English language acquisition for use with multilingual learners. To the next slide. So for that tool, we're using it in a variety of ways. For example, in our early learning classrooms, we are teaching lesson planning, and the teachers use it for lesson planning in VPK and our early childhood special education classrooms. For students who are on individual education programs or plans in special education, often it will be used as a tool to monitor growth and progress monitoring for those plans. And it may be included as part of an evaluation. So students that have had this tool administered over a number of years, the assessment teams will use it as a marker of growth. The tool is also used in our ProPay system. So in early childhood special education, teachers use it for their professional learning plans and student learning goals. And then finally, the data is used to report to the Minnesota Department of Education as part of the requirements for the kindergarten entry profile. So finally, to share with you some of the impact of COVID on our early learning programs. During the 2021 school year, and probably prior, there were fewer families that were coming for screening or special education evaluations. As the pandemic has continued, families are showing up, and they're not waiting any longer, which has really put an increase on the number of screening and families showing up for special education evaluations. We have seen both nationally and I think anecdotally, locally, we know that some students have been impacted in their developmental delays and growth. We've also, on the plus side, seen opportunities for families to see their children in virtual environments and be able to interact with their teachers where they might not have in the past. And I've had teachers share from time to time about parents really enjoying the time that they've been able to observe their children learning. And then finally, really it's a shout out to all of our staff across programs who have been incredibly resilient in providing consistent support to students to cover staff absences and other pieces. I just can't say enough about the teams and the people that I work with. And that concludes our presentation for this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lena and Dr. Cherry. Do board members have any comments or questions? Rickard?
Thank you, Chair Chester. Just one question on the statistic, the 75% statistic enrolling in kindergarten. That is, those are the students that are enrolling in our kindergarten. We don't know what happens to the other 25%, whether they don't enroll, whether they're enrolled in another district or school.
Director Alt, we don't. Our data is limited at a district, but we can work with MDE to find out where those children go and work with them to do a data request. So that is in my plan, to be able to do a deeper dive, to look at the data to find out where children are going, and thinking about surveying families or being able to collect some information as they leave.
Awesome. Thank you.
You bet.
Anybody else? Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Now we'll move to the informational portion of our meeting. The first is a report about guidelines for sharing board meetings, and I will be presenting again. And so this is a portion of our, we had a workshop at our last meeting regarding our guidelines for how we would want to share our school board meetings to the public, and our protocol regarding that. And so in the document that is attached here in board book, our statement purpose is that it is our responsibility as a school board and a school district to be as transparent with our community, and that's our number one goal. And our expectation is that whenever possible that we make our meetings open to the public for their view and digestion. And so as part of regular and special board meetings, they will be conducted with full audio-visual transmission with multiple cameras, presentations shared as part of live streaming, and also available for access online at our website and through BCTV as possible. And then recordings will also be made available as well. And regular board meetings, as the one that's tonight, is being live streamed and recorded. And any special board meetings, except those involving any related to expulsions, will be live streamed and recorded as well, and as well as special board meetings. And one of the new parts that we, and some of this is related to COVID, and having gone into the Zoom world as with all of the closures, we were streaming our committee meetings, which were always open to the public but wasn't part of live broadcast. And and so we have, as a board, agreed that we would like to have our legislative committee and our policy review committee and our workshops and work sessions also available, and live access as possible, and then also having that transmission. But it may not be multiple camera views, it might just be singular camera. And so that is something new that we are opening up and wanting to make sure in terms of our focus for transparency opens more people to be able to view our meetings and what's discussed in relation to our district. Anybody else want to add? Director Alt?
I just had an addition, I think, in the workshop, if I'm not mistaken. We had mentioned our YouTube channel being mentioned in this document, yeah.
Yes, yes.
So maybe, I mean, this is great.
Yeah.
And I appreciate, the other comment was I appreciated the conversation that we had and the willingness of the whole board to do this because, people may not be able to join us in person. And so this just gives them another venue for seeing our work outside of the regular meetings. So thank you.
Yes. Any other discussion or comment? Oh, Director Miller?
Yeah, thank you. Not being at the workshop and discussion, I apologize, so potentially this was covered, but with the addition of streaming our committee meetings and such, and basically pretty significantly expanding the amount of streaming time we're doing, did we address the cost element of that?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
So what we came to conclusion was is that the committees would meet here and then with one single camera so there wouldn't, and then the other thing that was discussed, but once we approve it in the consent agenda for committee assignments, was to try to get the committees to meet on the same day, not overlap time, so that maybe it would be less staff needing to be multiple days, so it'd be in a singular day that both committees would meet.
Thank you.
Great. Next, we will receive an update about District 191's efforts to implement COVID-19 related educational and public health guidance issued by the MDE and the MDH respectively. We have Brian Gersich, Assistant Superintendent, and Bernie Bean, Lead Licensed School Nurse, and Dana Thompson, Special Ed Supervisor.
Well, I'll start us off here. Thank you, Chair Chester and members of the board. Naturally, I'm here filling in this evening, so I'm just going to make some brief introductory comments before turning it over to Bernie and to Dana as part of our presentation. But I do want to share some of the data kind of locally for District 191 and some positive trends, I think, in my opinion, as we work to maintain in-person learning for our students in this post-winter break COVID surge that we've experienced throughout the country, but certainly in our community as well. From a staffing perspective, if you were to talk about prior to this week, in any given day, we were ranging between 56 and 75 requests for substitute teachers. Over the last week, that's been in the 30s, with a range of about 31 to 36. So just the number of subs that we have requested is significantly down, which certainly leads to an increase in sub fill rates. We were averaging before this week under 50% of those positions filled. Certainly with fewer subs, your percentage filled probably goes up. That's closer to 65%, which simply means there's less time when we have unfilled positions. But again, there still are times when we have unfilled positions. So I continue to want to make sure that we recognize staff from all different positions throughout our district who consistently help us perform functions outside of their typical role, just to make sure we continue to function as a district, which is kind of ironic from Guy who's sitting at this table, who isn't usually sitting at this table. Our student attendance rates have also improved from an absenteeism or percentage of students not in attendance, probably in that 13 to 14% range this week into the single digits. And students and staff across our district, just the number of reported cases of COVID significantly declining. So certainly, as we know, in the world of COVID, things can shift rapidly. That's a district snapshot, and certainly we have some of our sites that we continue to monitor, which will ebb and flow with those pieces of data. But across the spectrum, at least from that perspective, some positive things as we're going into this. And I will now turn it over to Bernie Bean, who will give some really more specific numbers, as she typically would as part of this report.
Good evening. Thank you. Good evening, Board of Directors and Chair Chester. So Minnesota is still in a high transmission rate, level of community transmission. The positivity rate for week 2 which is January 9th to January 15th, is very comparable to week 1. Currently, the positivity rate for Minnesota is 22.2%. Last week, it was 22.7%. For Dakota County, the rate is slightly down the percentage from 26.1% to 24.9%. Positivity for Scott County is slightly up, 27.1% from 26.5%. The breakthrough infection rate continues to inch its way up a little bit. Last week it was 5.8%. This week it is 6.9%. In terms of the 7-day case rate for positive individuals per 100,000, both Scott County and Dakota County have seen an increase. Last week, Dakota County's case rate was 1,332. This week, it's 1,680. For Scott County, the case rate last week was 1,226, and this week it's 1,521. With time, these case rate numbers are becoming less reliable, and that's due to the backlog of positive reports being filed and worked through MDH, but also the high number of at-home positive cases that aren't reported. Moving forward, MDH will be placing more of a focus on hospitalizations and death reports for their surveillance. In the past week, Dakota County had 14 newly reported deaths, which makes it the 4th highest county for a 7-day death rate in the state. Scott County has had 4 deaths reported in the last week. Hospitalizations in the Twin Cities have decreased. However, the capacity continues to be tight. For District 191, cumulatively for staff for the school year, we have been informed of 276 positive cases. 191 of those resulted in an investigation and a report to MDH. For students, cumulatively, we have been informed of 1,278 positive cases, with 672 of those cases being investigated and reported to MDH. As we have learned with the pandemic, COVID is unpredictable, and it makes us wonder what is on the horizon. We don't have a crystal ball. However, CDC, with its forecasting programs, predicts that the Omicron surge may be peaking right now and will drop rapidly in the next couple weeks. The wastewater treatment plant surveillance is indicating that this peak may have happened last week. Our data for this week looks very different than it did after winter break. So far this week, for students and staff reporting positive cases, we have had 68 cases reported, and 42 of those required an investigation. Last week, that count was 200. During the last board meeting, that count was 285. So we are seeing a significant decrease in our cases. So this week, for staff, we offered our new optional COVID screening program. We transitioned from Vault saliva screening to the Midwest Coordination Center with nasal swab screening. Screening is offered at each site every other Wednesday for staff. We did place an additional order for at-home kits for students and staff, but we were informed last week that they're on back order. So we continue to partner with the Dakota Child and Family Clinic to offer testing to our staff and to our students and their families. As far as vaccinations, we are steadily seeing an increase in our student coverage rate. The most significant increase has happened from the beginning of January to now in our elementary levels. For students completing their first dose on the elementary level, the first week in January, it was 28.08%, and this week it's 32.16%. And for second doses on the elementary level, it went from 17.51% to 22.62%. So we're steadily making gains in our vaccination rates, and we'll continue to offer and provide resources to families that wish to partake in that resource. In this week, or until February, Minnesota is offering a $200 Visa gift card for any 5 to 11-year-old that completes their vaccination series by February 28th. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Bernie. Good evening, Chair Chester, Assistant Superintendent Gersich, and members of the board. I appreciate your time and attention to this very important subject. My name is Dana Thompson, and I'm currently serve as a special education supervisor. I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist. Throughout this presentation, you'll see several sources cited. If you'd like to read more about any particular piece of information, please let me know and I can provide the reference. With me is Megan.
I'm Megan Gower-Close. I'm the school social worker at Hidden Valley Elementary, and I'm grateful to be here with Dana.
Thank you, Megan. The primary focus of this brief presentation is staff mental health, though we will highlight some of the district initiatives in place to support student mental health. It's broken down into 5 parts. Before we can discuss solutions, we must identify the need. To this end, I will clarify what the need is and what research-based assumptions went into the creation of this presentation. I will move to key findings from current research, primarily done within the last year. This research pulls from a national sample and does not necessarily represent ISD 191 specifically. Next, I will discuss what organizational supports the researchers recommend based upon their findings before Megan talks about what we have in place in 191 for both staff and students. We are in the business of student achievement. As we focus on the well-being of staff, it may seem that our focus is shifting away from our primary goal. However, research shows that staff well-being has a direct impact on student achievement. As educators experience more stress and more fatigue, their natural human reaction can lead to increased levels of conflict, poor problem solving, bigger reaction to student behavior, which subsequently increases said behavior, which puts more stress on the teacher, on and on and on. Cobb refers to this phenomena as a burnout cascade. We have all experienced significant trauma due to the pandemic and to other events outside our individual control. However, educators often experience what researchers call secondary traumatic stress. The National Child Trauma Stress Network, that's the organization that does ACEs, if you're familiar with that research, defines secondary traumatic stress as the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. You may have heard this phenomenon called compassion fatigue. So far, I've been able to find only one published study that's explored the impact of COVID-19 on student education and well-being. Approximately 25% of their sample reported experiencing anxiety symptoms, which are positively correlated with increased concerns about academic delays, economic effects of the pandemic, and impacts on daily life. The information shared on this slide is a brief summary of some key findings regarding the impact of the pandemic on educators. Remember, this information was collected from a national sample and is not necessarily directly representative of ISD 191. The images you see are from the Mission Square Research Institute Executive Summary, and just those by themselves offer something of a succinct illustration of our current reality. Many pandemic-era teaching conditions were linked to increased reports of job-related stress, depressive symptoms, and burnout. 27% of teachers self-reported symptoms consistent with clinical depression, and 37% self-reported symptoms consistent with generalized anxiety. 53% of teachers say they are thinking of leaving the profession more now than they were before the pandemic. 19% of teachers started or increased alcohol use to deal with stress during the pandemic. 39% of K-12 employees reported they are working more hours now than prior to the pandemic. K-12 employees were significantly more likely to perceive themselves to be at risk of exposure to COVID at work than other government employees. 6 in 10 K-12 respondents reported that they and their family have been negatively impacted financially by the COVID-19 pandemic. K-12 employees' general satisfaction with their employer showed a sharp decline from 69% to 44%, being extremely satisfied with their employer in October of 2020. The image that's titled Top 3 Emotions Felt at Work I feel it's important to highlight that the others are other government employees. So other people that you would assume, face similar mandates, structures, but if you look at it, the difference between K-12 employees and other government employees is pretty stark. The key organizational supports suggested by research can be broken down into 4 categories. Number 1 is time. That means reducing educator workloads and, if feasible, creating planning days. Number 2 is open communication. That means keeping staff informed of the current reality, acknowledging struggles and the difficulty of the current situation, and having a climate where dialogue between admin and staff regarding the identification of stressors is open and welcome. Number 3 is creating a school culture, and part of that is creating a culture of awareness around mental health and secondary traumatic stress conditions. That could mean peer support groups, call lines, intentional space for educators to recharge. It could also mean training administrators to spot early signs of mental health struggles and considering training a group of willing employees to serve as mental health ambassadors who build awareness and connect colleagues to resources. 4th are technical supports. This is where I categorize things like employee mental health and assistant programs. I felt that this quote was important enough to highlight on its own slide. Teachers, like all of us, have been given the direction to focus on self-care for almost 2 years now. The message has been heard, but cannot always be followed. At this point, we must approach our collective trauma as a community. Self-care needs to be built into the culture of the school. Over the last year and a half, and since COVID began, we've implemented several district initiatives. As mentioned previously, time was one of the most important aspects of increasing teacher mental health. You may recall a program titled Move Forward, Adjust, and Pause. This program required administration to take a hard look at district initiatives and compare them to staff capacity. Everything on the list was and is important, but some could be paused, some could be adjusted, and some needed to continue moving forward. By doing this, we've reduced the number of time commitments required of our staff. Several people have completed circle keeper training over the last year. This restorative practice has been implemented in several meetings and has allowed a space to process and share. We have several technical supports provided to us through our insurance. Preferred One is a section on their website for COVID-19 mental health support. Amplify, through Preferred One, provides different medical solutions through no additional cost. And there's actually an entire section in Amplify about mental health providers. Ability Assist is an employee counseling program. Additionally, the student support teams created a staff website focused on mental health supports. It includes videos on meditation, self-care ideas, coloring pages, and links to resources and more. Finally, and perhaps most visibly, we have several district staff subbing in schools. Teachers have commented to me about how important it is to them to see administration doing things like teaching, covering lunch supervision, and even manning front desks. We're all in this together, and that sense of community directly addresses staff well-being.
So to move on to talk about current supports that are in our schools, those supports might vary, but I can tell you that the staff in our buildings are doing the best they can with the resources that they have available and they have access to. So some of those initiatives that are in place include looking at time and really protecting teacher time, providing teacher choice and autonomy when available, shifting or reducing meetings to look a little bit different to allow for that. Secondly, communication. So perhaps centrally located information when there's so much to know and so much that's changing, staff having an ability to find that information quickly and effectively. And the emails that are coming from administration are conveying empathy and understanding, acknowledging their own struggles and kind of how we're going to move forward together. As far as school culture goes, really looking at comprehensive attention to staff needs as professionals, but also as people. And examples of building and keeping staff morale include simple things like sharing positive affirmations or notes and treats in mailboxes, CICs who listen and give space or even step in a classroom, donut days, monthly, weekly potlucks and breakfasts, food competitions, and out-of-school activities as COVID allows and as we're able to do so. And then looking at technical supports, covering classrooms when teachers might need to step out and take a break themselves, and a designated space where they can go and be comfortable to connect with one another when able, and to also just decompress. So schools' efforts towards creating a positive school climate and culture are especially robust, and areas where we perhaps fall short include time in those technical supports.
As I mentioned earlier, current peer-reviewed U.S.-based research on the impact of COVID-19 on K-12 students is sparse. Preliminary findings suggest that proactive support is necessary. Local data will likely be available in the next year or so as the Minnesota Student Survey is completed. In ISD 191, we plan to complete that survey March 7th to 18th.
In terms of supporting our students' mental health through SEL or social emotional learning, we've got quite a few programs in our district and throughout our schools. So Second Step is a program that's used in our middle schools and just got started in our elementary schools this year. It's designed to reduce impulsive, high-risk, aggressive behaviors and increase children's social competence and other protective factors. It's intended to teach kids how to identify and understand their own and others' emotions, choose positive goals, and successfully manage reactions when emotionally charged. We're getting positive feedback from our teachers on the ease of this instruction of this program and student engagement with these lessons. Additionally, quite a few of our schools also participate in Move Mindfully. And this is a program where there's different breathing techniques, many different stretches, mindfulness-based practices that are helping students kind of get that energy out and be able to refocus on their learning. Some teachers use this to provide movement during transitions. And then Headway, our school-based mental health therapy provided by our therapists at our school buildings, is reducing barriers for our families to access therapy for our students. The services are provided through negotiations between Headway Services and the family. So they're actually able to work with kind of that separate organization under the umbrella of our school buildings. We also have after-school groups such as Proud and Prism, which is providing safe spaces for students to come together as they are and feel a sense of belonging, in addition to community ed support such as like PALS programming and BYC at the middle school. Our student support teams, our school counselors, our school social workers, our school psychs are working really closely with individuals and groups of students who have identified support needs and providing that support as frequently as possible. Our PBIS, our Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports, is teaching expected school behavior and celebrating successes through shout-outs and tickets and school-wide celebrations. And a part of that program oftentimes is our check-in, check-out. So really looking at our kids who are perhaps exhibiting the highest needs, connecting them with a positive mentor in the school, giving them feedback on how things are going and celebrating their success with them. We also have some Park Nicollet partnerships, such as Change to Chill, Now, and Growing Through Grief. Change to Chill is a grant-funded program to support students who need structured space within the school to address their mental health needs. Now is a school-based mental health service provided directly by Park Nicollet Now therapists via telehealth while the student is at the school site. And these services are provided to the school at no cost to us or the student or family. It's through philanthropic avenues. And then Growing Through Grief is a collaborative death-related crisis management support. This unique program is currently provided across 15 partnering districts in 95 school locations, providing crucial grief support and education to children, families, and school communities. Additionally, we are using screeners and proactive meetings to identify students in need of support, such as SABRS, our Fast Bridge Behavior Assessment used in the middle schools, and our SST, our Student Support Teams, and our STAT teams, who meet to identify academic and behavioral interventions and supports for students and teachers alike. ESSER funding includes targeted funds for supporting positive student climate and community, as well as PBIS in the district that will be utilized over the next 2 years.
So to summarize, staff mental health has a direct effect on student mental health and on academic achievement. Staff right now are dealing with unprecedented demands. There are some research-supported mitigation strategies, many of which we're following through with, others that we can increase. Things like time, communication, technical supports, and school culture. ISD 191 is providing both district and school-level support for staff and students. However, levels of support vary, and more information about available supports needs to be shared. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dana and Megan, and Bernie and Assistant Superintendent Gersich. Do any board members have any comments or questions? Director Werb?
Thank you, Dana and Megan. It was an exceptional presentation, and I appreciate all the research that went into that and the data that you provided. Just a couple of questions and comments. So with all the options that are available for staff, is there someone, one particular person that's managing all of the things that are available to staff, that's, continuously monitoring and making sure that those are continuous and that they're ongoing, that they're available to the staff?
There's not. Many of this is done, like some of the school-specific supports for staff are school-specific. So based on the resources that that school has available, what they've allocated, who's there. The district supports come from various areas, some from our HR department, some from the curriculum department, such as that Move Forward, Just Pause. Restorative Circles was an initiative we got through a SHIP grant. And then the district staff 17 schools, that's just an all-hands-on-deck approach. But there's not one person or one organization that is getting this all together.
So it would be basically per site, like
Well-
what they're, per like school site, how they're managing the
Yeah,
staff?
I mean, there's the district supports are available everywhere. And that's
Okay.
being managed through DEC, but different, different departments.
Yeah, I could,
The school-specific stuff, yeah, I'll pass on to Megan.
oh, okay. I was just going to say, I'm, in my knowledge, like building leadership teams are really highly focused, at least in my building, on kind of staff needs, right? And so we happen to be working with a staff wellness committee
Oh, great.
that's been, developed, right, in honor of keeping with and holding accountable and being able to actually implement what we know would be helpful. So I know other buildings likely maybe have a PBIS team that's focusing on staff, but I think to echo Dana, there's probably not one size fits all in terms of how schools are able to implement that and what their teams look like, or if there's an individual helping guide that process for their school.
Okay, I guess I just want to make sure that it's continuous and that, there's somebody there that's kind of driving it and saying, hey, just don't forget, you have this available to you, Okay. And then as far as the second step, I was looking into that, and I think it's a good program. I'm a little bit disappointed it doesn't go up to the high school level. And I do, realize that, there's always, a lot of time invested when we vet certain programs. But I just want to say, as far as, there's always going to be new things and new programs that come available. And right now I know that resilience youth programs are gaining traction, and they're trauma-based. And we have a high level of students that come from immigrant families where we know there's high levels of family trauma. And I just, I feel like, as a school that has that level of, students with trauma, that it's our due diligence to make sure we're addressing and trying to bring in programs that would address that. So all I'm saying is that if we have the opportunity to look at something that could be better suited to those students, that we should look at that. And I'm not saying that what we have isn't good. I just want to make sure you know, I don't think that what we have, I think we do great with the programs we have, but it's always like evaluating and, you know, saying, could we do something different or do it better? That's all I really want to.
And there is programming like trauma-informed schools, right? Which is a framework, kind of like how we see our PBIS or how we see other initiatives, right? That would be a guiding lens, kind of like our CPSS. That could perhaps be considered, right, as a part of just, it's what we do, it's how we do it, it's how we do everything, you know, and then we have other curriculums that are supporting SEL. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's something definitely that we see in my work, in our team's work every day.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Dr. Connor?
And I'd also like to thank you for all your hard work in gathering your data. Bernie, this is for you. For the vaccine, how do you get your vaccine data for these 5 to 12-year-olds? Is it just district? Because I kind of missed that. I was listening, I thought. But I wasn't sure if it was district or county. I know you mentioned both. But I'm just wondering how you get the data of who's getting these shots.
Yeah, so we're a user of the Minnesota Registry, and so part of that contract language allows us to be able to look at our vaccination records for our students.
Oh.
And that's where we receive that information.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Okay. I didn't know that information was public, or, well, not public, but you have a contract. Okay, good.
Correct.
Thank you.
Any other comment? Director Alt? And Director
Just first, a question for Bernie. You shared the vaccination rates for elementary students. Would you happen to have rates for secondary?
I do have those.
Or did I miss those?
Nope.
Maybe? Okay.
Because the rates only went up like a percent each, so I didn't really share those, because the greatest one was with the elementary. But for our middle schools, for first doses, we're at 50.8%. Second doses, 44.94%. In our high school, first dose is 63.08%, and second dose is 58.86%.
Thank you. And then just 2 comments on the staff and student wellness presentation. Thank you both very much. Always interesting to hear research that draws from national data and kind of think about it in terms of how it affects our district. And appreciating that the Minnesota Student Survey is going to be offered in March. Particularly this year, the results of that survey are going to be so very important. Oh, yeah. And so I just, wanted to, send a shout out that hopefully everyone in our schools who are, presenting the test to our students will help them understand really, this is your honest response. We need to know what it is. We use it. I know you use it. I know we look at it. We will be looking at it. And given the pandemic and everything that our students have been through, so very important for that test to be taken seriously every year, but more so this year. And then the only other comment I had as I was sitting here listening to you talking about what the psychologists are doing and the social workers are doing, how proud I am that this board years ago decided to invest in social workers first and foremost. That was a huge decision. And, it wasn't, I don't believe that it was very common at the time. We felt that it was the right decision, and I am so proud that we have all of the staff present to support our students and our staff in whatever capacity is possible. But then also the next step of bringing our psychs, making our psychs our school psychs. And really connecting those talented and highly trained professionals with the needs of our students. And I feel like that investment is really, it's what we need right now. We couldn't have predicted it, but, yay for us.
Director Hume?
This is a question that may not have an answer, and that's okay. But how do you what are your thoughts on how we might be able to measure the impacts of the support that the district is providing for staff?
That is a good question. It's something I had considered as I wrote this up. I think something like a staff survey would be appropriate. There's likely some out there that have been vetted and normed that we can adapt or borrow. If there's not, we can easily create one. It could be something that we do anonymously, that's in like one response each so that people can be honest in their responses. But I am very interested in finding that data and seeing it in some capacity.
This idea of staff support right now was a very big topic of conversation at the MSBA state conference a couple weeks ago. So it's been on my mind for a long time, but especially over the last couple of weeks. So the timing of this presentation tonight was perfect for me. I guess my other, again, question that may not have an answer is, and maybe it's related to the survey, if a survey were to get done at some point, but is there anything more that could be done to support the staff and help them? Really on my mind is, with staff satisfaction, how important it is for student achievement. And so if our staff are not in a mental place where they're able to be as effective as they want to be, it makes it harder for our students to be able to learn.
I believe there probably is more things we can do, and I want to emphasize that all of these great things we're doing, staff are still stressed out. Staff are still having a difficult time every day. I think that everybody is aware of the need, administration, district level, building level, and are doing everything they can think of to meet staff needs. That's probably why we see such variance across buildings, because each building is maximizing their individual resources to meet this need. There are, I'm sure, more things we can do, but there isn't any more low-hanging fruit, I don't think, on meeting that need. So it's something we have to look at that's outside the box, something that might be drastic, or I honestly don't know, but I do think there is a need for additional support.
And I suppose there's always more that could be done, so it's a matter of prioritizing and trying to decide what's going to have the best impact. Thank you.
And I think it's sometimes what we don't necessarily believe is directly tied to staff wellness, right? It's, our behavior referrals and student support referrals are up 300% this year versus the entire school year last year. So we're at the end of the January and we're already at 3% more of students needing more. And of course, they're needing more from their teachers, right? And there's only so much they can give. So that people power, I think when we talk about some of the barriers to implementing and supporting our students and thus supporting our teachers with students who need support, it just kind of all trickles down. So I agree with Dana and thinking outside of the box and sometimes looking at different avenues that really will trickle back to staff feeling supported too.
Thank you.
So, to just piggyback off my prior comments on resilience, that can be used for staff as well, and you could possibly partner with local health providers to come in and do that training for staff.
Yeah, one thing I want to emphasize, though, is that training would be valuable for staff. I think the most valuable thing would be building into the culture of the school in some way. Instead of saying, here's more that you can do to be resilient, here's more self-care stuff, like how do we make our schools more trauma-informed for both staff and students in a way that acknowledges that need and doesn't put the onus entirely on the individual.
Agreed. Add one piece to that, to the question about what else can we do or what next. And one of the things that Dana and I talked about in the preparation, we met a couple of times, and I appreciate that she clustered things down into very practical themes from the research. And so we talked about how a next step could be bringing this to, for example, our leadership, our principals, and helping them understand the research and cluster this down and say, if you want to help your staff, time, communication, school culture, and technical supports, and go through and find in your own building, or departments for that matter, where are we hitting this, and where do we need to shore some things up. So even, beyond bringing in new programs, just the focus on, do you have something where you're addressing time? Do you have something you're addressing the other 4 areas? So again, I appreciate the research because it does create those practical themes that I do think our leaders can get around and say, I can do better in blank. And all of us can say, let's pick something and do better.
I just want to say thank you for bringing voice to this matter because I think we all understand the hard work that staff and teachers have been put under. But just being able to just have you present, both of you to present, because you're in there, you're hearing it, you're doing the work and bringing it to us. I really appreciate the research. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Anybody? Director?
Yes, I just wanted to, let Director Hume know that I believe it was maybe November, October of last year, there was a survey done through AMSD, specifically asking teachers what they needed and their emotional support that was not, mental health support that was not being addressed, and where they're at with COVID and that type of thing. I think I reported it one time, but of course that was months ago. So they also have one that I was going to report when we have our next committee reports. They just did a survey directly asking principals like where they're standing and what support they need. It's very interesting. Also, it is on the website of AMSD if anyone's interested. And it, of course, it touches on a little bit of what students say that they need. We did have a panel of students say that and how COVID is affecting them. But very interesting take with the principals. We know what the teachers are going through, but how the principals are kind of in the middle, how they relate. What is their relationship with the board? Are they getting support from the board? Are they getting support from the superintendent? So really interesting where they stand. Some insights that I didn't know until they brought that out. And it's like, oh, they have a tough one too.
Thanks for adding that. And that was one of the surveys I was thinking about when I said we could maybe adapt one for local use. And the point about administration is really well taken. It was kind of outside the scope of this because I wanted to focus on teachers. But a lot of what we're asking here is administration to help support those teachers. Secondary traumatic stress continues all the way up the chain.
Right.
So-
Yeah, who's supporting them?
Exactly. I mean, we do have shared trauma. We have shared experiences in this whole thing. So using this time to strengthen our sense of community in whatever way we can, making this a group effort in some ways, is really what we have to do because we are experiencing this as a community. We need to address it as a community.
Again, thank you so much. My comment is with the presentation, it reminds me of correlated to parenting. So like you're supposed to put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can be able to help those around you. And also realizing that many of our teachers are coming in as parents themselves, so they're lacking oxygen to be able to support not only their children at home, but the many children that they're trying to educate. And no, I completely agree that we need to and support embedding into school culture because often most of us, if we're so overwhelmed, to ask us to try to seek out our own help is just too much. And to have it embedded in culture where it's just automatic takes that next step away from that added stress onto the individual too. So I really appreciate this presentation tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I wanted to pause because I failed to introduce you too, because Superintendent Dr. Battle is unable to join us tonight, so standing in is Assistant Superintendent Brian Gersich. So pardon my miss on doing that. Next on our agenda is committee board appointment and school assignment reports. So we can start with our committee reports. Let's start with the policy committee.
Thank you, Chair Chester. The Policy Committee met on Tuesday, January 18th, and most of the policies reviewed during that meeting are on tonight's agenda. The committee's February meeting date will be posted once it has been established.
Thank you. I'll report for the Legislative Committee. We met earlier here in January as well. We had Senator Duckworth at our meeting to talk about the bill that we would like to bring forward or have put forward at the state for exemption on sale of buildings. And he was very supportive and had asked and kind of gave us the how things work at the Capitol, which was awesome. So in order to get some things to move, where we kind of maybe found where we got stuck, was that we need across the aisle chief authorship of a bill. and he offered to chief author. And so we had reached out to Senator Port because we thought, because it was going to be co-authored. She said it was just fine that Senator Duckworth chief authored the bill, and then they would have the support of Senator Port as well. And so that is our next step. So that concludes our report for legislative. Any report from negotiations?
No report for negotiations.
Okay. Any other reports regarding board assignments? Director Connor.
Mine is from AMSD, as I just mentioned a little bit ago. We had a speaker on January 21st named Katie Pakel, and she's from the U of M. She trains superintendents and principals. She gave, like I said, this. I'm just going to hit highlights because this is on the AMSD website. And so, but just they did a survey analysis on school principals, and they collected that data. And they touched on what students need, and they just said that they do want more input in learning, in what they learn, what they want to learn, and in their curriculum. Also, they said that their challenges are low engagement, they have loss of instruction, and they just constantly have active feedback from parents about their schooling and their education. So students are overwhelmed in that capacity and trying to keep up with their work. They say that they don't feel that they can share their opinions, and that, that they can't share their opinions, and they don't, they're just not getting the support from the principal and from the teachers. But as focusing on the principals, because this was really about the principals analysis, but they just touched on the student part too. The principals, they said 66% of them need mental health because they're feeling it from the students, from the teachers, from the parents. And they asked specifically, were they getting enough support from the school? A couple other points. This has been the most challenging challenging year of their career because they're understaffed, lack of funding, staff and student principal needs, and the pressure from the district, teachers, students, and there's just no staff support. And that's pretty much it. Anything else you want to find? It is very interesting statistics on the AMSD website. Thank you.
Director Connor, any other reports?
I can do it quick. The Burnsville High School Hall of Fame Committee met on January 19th. I was unable to go to the meeting, so I can't report on the meeting, but I did want to mention that nominations for the class of 2022, the nomination form is live on the district website, and you have until March the 15th at 3 p.m. to submit a nomination. So if you know someone that would perhaps be worthy of induction into the Burnsville High School Hall of Fame, information can be found on the district website.
Thank you. I can do a report from Intermediate District 917. They met the 3rd of January, and they approved the 2-year extension as well for our Cedar School building, and then because the Supreme Court ruling hadn't passed, they passed on their policy regarding vaccinations and testing at that meeting as well. And they are still in the midst of the strategic planning process, and they're going to be having a couple of board retreats soon in terms of continued work there. Any other school assignment reports? Any other reports? No? Okay. Next, we will move to the consent agenda, or business portion of our meeting, and the consent agenda. Although board action is required, it is generally unnecessary to hold discussions on these items. In the event a board member wishes to discuss an item, that item will be removed for separate consideration. Do we have any items that we want to move off the consent agenda? Okay. Seeing none. All those in favor, or no, do I have a motion to approve tonight's consent agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Director Oak. Second by Director Connor. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. We'll move on to new business. The first item under our new business is to approve a cooperative sponsorship in badminton with Prior Lake beginning in the spring of 2022. We have Guillaume Peck, Director of Athletics, to present.
Thank you, Chair Chester, directors, Assistant Superintendent Gersich. I am here to ask for a cooperative sponsorship in badminton with Prior Lake. I was approached by Prior Lake's activities director. They are hoping to try to start a standalone program. And so typically one of the pathways is to co-op in those first 2 years to try to draw enough interest before you dissolve the cooperative sponsorship and become an independent program. This is huge for the neighboring communities. Currently, we are the only school in the South Suburban Conference that offers badminton. The next closest, I believe, would either be Eden Prairie or Bloomington Kennedy. And so the benefits to this cooperative sponsorship, it potentially adds an additional team and gets us closer to that magic number with the Minnesota State High School League, where they actually sanction and run the state tournament. Currently, the state tournament is ran by volunteers and an athletic director who is gracious enough to host the 20, I believe, 8 schools currently that offer badminton throughout the metro and state. And then that cost is broken up evenly amongst the teams that are participating. So I think this is a good opportunity for the sport to grow. The majority of the teams are diverse. It's a no-cut sport. You can have 85 kids on the badminton team because you have enough courts to play exhibition. So it's a great opportunity in student engagement. And I'd like to be a partner with Prior Lake to hopefully get them up and running and have their standalone team in a couple of years.
So with that, you're seeking a motion to approve the resolution to approve this cooperative sponsorship of badminton with Prior Lake. Do I have a motion to approve this cooperative sponsorship?
So moved.
Moved by Director Hume.
Second.
Second by Director Worm. Do we have any discussion?
I have a question. Just out of curiosity, you mentioned the magic number to be able to have the State High School League host a tournament. What is that magic number?
Oh, gosh.
It's okay if you don't.
I believe it's either 30 or 32 is what the number was several years ago
You said there's
pre-COVID.
28 currently, so we're not too far off then.
Yep, and my understanding was that there were 4 schools potentially that were planning on implementing badminton before COVID hit.
Okay.
And then it just became a challenge to try to implement a new program under the circumstances that we've
Very
been under, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other discussion?
I have a question.
Okay.
So is badminton a spring sport, right?
That is correct. Yep.
All those in favor? Say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next on our agenda is to approve the revised FY22 budget. Tonight, we have Lisa Ryder, Executive Director of Business Services.
And I was told I don't have to give a report or anything this time, so do I just have to do nothing then? I mean,
Good evening, Chair Chester, Assistant Superintendent Gersich, and members of the board.
Sylvie.
Tonight, I bring to you the fiscal year 2022 revised budget, and I'm joined by, with Tyler Daney, our Director of Finance. He is the individual who pulled together much of the data that you see collected tonight and in the reports with a collaborative effort with Human Resources, staff, many department directors, and the finance team. So as we get started, I'm wondering if they're going to, let's see, there it comes. As we get started on the slides that you see before you, included in the board packet is the slides as well as then some resources that we'll touch on at the very end. A little context. As we begin this discussion, keep in mind that in June of this past June, fiscal year 22 adopted budget was approved by the board. Since then, we have learned of more accurate data around our, starting audited fund balances, for example, as we completed that audit process in the meantime. Our fall enrollment numbers we know now, and we also have a much better handle on the federal funding that is available to us and how we plan to use that for this fiscal year. So many of those things are taken into consideration and are typically a part of the any revised budget that a district may consider. As we take a look at the overview, we are going to provide the board and community tonight with some financial information and some discussion of the resources we've received for the COVID-19 relief. And we also have a recommendation to the board for approval of the fiscal year 2022 revised budget tonight. The agenda is, as you can see here, we will cover exactly where does our money come from, what restrictions do we have, how do we spend that money, what is the shortfall and why is that happening, and what's the current situation. So typically you will see us present what we call an all funds sheet, okay? And if you take a look at the recommendation before the board, it is the total revenues and the total expenditures of all funds that the board approves in the action. So as we look at this slide, you can see that there are various rows, and each of those rows is what we call a different fund. And the beginning column on the left of numbers is our audited fund balance. So as of June 30, 2021, that information has been audited by our audit firm, and in December you received that report and approved it. And so those are our beginning starting points now, whereas when we did the adopted budget, we were projecting. So these are now final. As you take a look at the next column numbers, it's the revenue budget that is being presented to you tonight, along with the expenditure budget next to the right. And that then projects forward a fund balance for this June 30th of 22. Let's see, a couple of things. The first three items that you see listed, general, food service, and community service, those are all operating funds. And as you take a look at the capital projects line, you see that there is a 0 at the projected fund balance. So the intent is that we will be spending down that fund balance completely during this fiscal year. The debt service funds for revenues, that includes the proceeds we received from the River Ridge Education Center as it was sold, net of the $300,000 that needed to be utilized by special education services within the general fund. It also includes on the revenue and expenditures the refunding bonds that we had approved back in, I believe, November. Let's see, the internal service fund, we have self-insured health, self-insured dental, our severance is included there, as well as the bond proceeds that were sold back in 2009 that fund all of our other post-employment benefits that some members of our bargaining groups are eligible for beyond retirement. Let's see. All of the funds that you see here are the totals of the revenues and the expenditures are what is included in the action item before the board. And we're going to now move into just the discussion of the general fund for the next few slides. So as we take a look at the general fund revenue, that is $135,885,717. So where does this money come from? 64% of our revenue comes from general and categorical state aid, while we have 23% that is in property taxes, and that's a pretty typical number for us coming from property taxes. The federal aid that you see is 11% this year. That is unusual. Usually that's around 5%. Okay? And then we have our local 2%. That is not too uncommon. As we take a look at now the restrictions that we might have around those revenues, I would like to point out that all of the first three are within the general fund. So within the general fund, we have what we call capital, and there's an annual allocation that school districts receive that can be used only for certain state statute approved personnel and equipment type expenditures. So then there is the title funds that districts may receive. Those are federal dollars typically designated for very specific purposes, and oftentimes those needs are associated with higher poverty rates. Our technology levy is something unique for us and some other districts who have this approved. For us, it was approved in 2015, and it is specifically for technology, personnel, and equipment. There are restrictions around community education funds as well as food and nutrition services, and they are kept in separate funds to keep track of them uniquely separate from the general fund. And then we have our capital building funds, which came from our 2015 referendum vote as well. We sold bonds, and those dollars were used for the modifications at the high school as well as many other sites, and the conversion for us to a 912 high school. Those funds are the ones that you see being expended fully this year. So that's an idea of what restrictions we may have around some of the funds that are received. So what about the expenditures that we have? When you take a look at the expenditures by type, this kind of breaks down how are we spending those dollars by the type of expenditures. So you see 78% of our funds expenditures are spent on people. Those are the people who actually get a paycheck from us, right? But when you take a look at the other 22%, much of that also includes contracted services. And when you consider contracted services for our district, that also includes our transportation, school bus drivers, and all those that support that. And it includes our substitute teachers. So the people that we have involved in this is even higher than you see the 78% because we have some things that are contracted, but yet it's the people that make it happen, right? So of the 22%, beyond the contracted services, that's on supplies and other types of facility expenditures. When you talk about the people, the next slide breaks down for us the information of salaries and benefits for just the general fund, broken down then by what we call the bargaining group, some of which are collective bargaining groups, and some of them are actually terms and conditions for the group. Regardless, you have the list of the group, you have the FTEs, and you have the salaries, benefits, their total, and what percentage of the whole is it that that group makes up. Again, just the general fund and just salaries and benefits. There is attached at the bottom a link which gives you further description of those various different groups in case you're interested as well. Taking a look at the general fund expenditures now by purpose, this is a little bit different look at the same expenditures of $136,035,698. Again, just the general fund. And in this case, we're taking a look at what type of department is it that this is going towards, right? So for instruction and all of our instructional support, we have 77% going there. When you talk about maintenance services, that 9% also includes $2.5 million of long-term facility maintenance projects that our board approves on an annual basis for that 10-year plan. We also have 6% of our expenditures that go to transportation. That includes special education as well as general education. Administration is 4%, and other costs culminate to 4% as well. The next slide, we start talking a little bit about that state aid formula. And the conversation that I guess we'd like to start sharing about within the revised budget, and you'll hear it again later in the workshop, is why is there a shortfall? If you take a look at this graph, this shows you on the first line that is on the top, you see this routinely from me, and it is a reminder of what it would be if we had received inflation on our formula, the general education formula, compared to the actual general education formula that has been approved each biennium for the last few years, okay? There's a gap. That gap continues, and that is oftentimes the issue for many school districts as to why they're struggling financially. So I want to talk a little bit about those numbers and how that looks for us. You have to kind of put it into perspective. So the legislature will talk about the increase on the gen ed formula, and we are very appreciative of the 2.45% that was increased for this year, as well as the 2% that's planned for the next year, FY23. At the same time, I need to help you understand exactly how much of the revenue actually is impacted by that. So the general fund, education fund generates for us about 41.6% of our total general fund revenue for the revised 22 budget. That general education formula increase, as I mentioned, was 2.45%. So it did go up to the 6,728 that we are now using in our calculation for the revenue that you see before you included in the budget. When you apply this increase with no change in enrollment from last year, that would equal for us almost $1.4 million, okay? That $1.4 million is the equivalent of 1.1% increase on all of our expenditures from the prior year. Each year, we also, though, need to consider the adjustments for our projected end-of-year enrollment. Once we apply that adjustment, our increase in revenue now is $312,910. That's additional income over what we had the previous year, and is the equivalent of a 0.2% increase in our expenditures from the prior year. Just trying to break down for you exactly what that looks like for us. So with that information in hand, this is the Gen Ed state aid. And as we take a look at the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about those federal relief funds that we have included in this current revised FY22 budget. The general fund is the first section on the left-hand side of the slide, where you can see a number of different lines with a bunch of finance codes. And I know people don't know what any of those numbers mean, and I understand that. But short of me having a very long name for every single one of them, what we've done is just list the number. And then if you are interested, you can refer to the Federal Relief Fund summary, which has been shared previously with you and is not operating as I expected at the moment. You should be able to click on that link and see all the details of these finance dimensions, and if you cannot, please let me know. But we can show, you can see from there the description of the actual item, that is Finance 140, for example. You can see what exactly is the dollar amount allocated to us, how much of it has been spent already or is still available, and what we plan to spend those dollars on. So it's a very helpful and useful detailed tool for anyone interested in taking a look at that. The key regarding this, this slide is the total of federal funds that you see used in the general fund. We have $9,468,267 of additional federal funds. These are dollars that do not include our typical title funds, okay? So this is above and beyond what is typical for us. In the in the Community Education Fund, there are 2 grants that are specifically for those areas, which one of them is the Preschool Grant, and the second one is the Adult Basic Education one-time money. So those 2 grants are $197,945. These dollars are all included in the budget. If we know that Finance 155, which is our ESSER 2 funds, that's the bulk of these funds that we're receiving in the general fund, and we anticipate that those dollars are probably going to be pretty well fully spent by the time we get to June 30th. They're pretty well identified and laid out so that we anticipate that's going to be fully spent. Some of these other funds, they may still carry over, as we may not need them as much, and yet we want to make sure they're included in the budget in case we do need them, and so that's why they're included. And if they are not utilized, they will then carry forward to the next year. Some of them do end, such as the COVID testing grant. So that's one of them we want to pay attention to and make sure that we meet those timelines for. All right, as we take a look then about the current reality. So this is a typical format that you see me review with you the total revenues and total expenditures. But since 2021, we have started to now separate out that federal relief revenue as well. So you will see the first 3 columns of numbers are actual audited results from past years. And then you will see the adopted budget that we began with from last June that was approved by the board. The last column on the right is our revised budget 21-22 that is brought to you tonight for approval. So our beginning total fund balance at the very top there is $29,521,880. That shifted. That changed from the adopted time frame, and it changed as a result of the actual audited results from the prior year. With that starting point then, we have our revenues listed, and I did break out that amount of dollars that are general fund, that are federal relief funds, separately from the other typical revenue. On the expenditure side, you see is similar, but you also notice that the expenditure dollar amount for those federal relief funds is not the same as the revenue. What that indicates, because it's lesser, it indicates that we are utilizing some of those expenditures in the typical expenditures that you would see us functioning with in a normal year without federal funds. So as we talked about when we did the adopted budget, you heard us discussing an approach that would utilize a few different things, one of which was the necessity for us to work with funds from the previous year, which you see as the $5,081,823. And so that would be using fund balance to cover the excess expenditures, right? We also discussed the use of federal funds to offset some of that impact. So what you see is a revised budget that only has an expenditure over revenues net of just about $150,000 compared to the $5 million. So what we've done is we've utilized approximately $4.3 million of federal funds to offset our typical expenditures. And at the same time, we have adjusted for some of the expenditures we know we're not incurring and that we've seen for the last 2 years happen in this pandemic. Things like you can't fill enough substitutes, you don't have as much cost, right? So those kinds of things are occurring. And so those expenditures we have addressed in our revised budget, reducing the expense and trying to get that as close as what we can anticipate at the end of the year for the audit. As you take a look at this, the fund balance, the unassigned fund balance you see, which is the last line of that fund balance right next to the very bottom there, and you divide that by your total expenditures and you come up with 14.11%. Our policy of the board calls for 8%. This is an increase from the projected amount that we did at adopted of only 6.46%. The change there is twofold. One, a reflection of the audited results impact on the beginning fund balance, and two, our reflection of what adjustments we've made to our current budget with using the federal funds as well as reduction in expenditure budgets. With this in mind, there's one last thing I wanted to share with you regarding the fiscal year 22 budget before we get to the recommendation, and that is the Capital Projects Fund. This is the fund that is being spent down to zero at the end of this fiscal year. And so I went back through to the beginning of this fiscal year of July 1, 21, and listed out all of the various different projects, and you can see the column that is indicating the invoices we've already paid, and then the next column is that which is yet to be billed, some of which is an estimate. You see nice big round numbers instead, and some of which is actually just the project may be already completed, but we haven't yet paid the bill. So for instance, I know the wrestling mats were delivered, I just haven't seen the bill come through the payments yet, okay? So in total, that's the expectation, is that we will be spending that down. You will also note, I would note that the security district-wide is the line item where we expect that depending upon how those estimates come out to actual, that if there's any excess, it's going to be spent in that security area and it's going to be used towards radios across our schools. So that's the game plan for the capital projects funds and how those dollars are planned to be spent for this year. With that in mind, there's other resources available here that are attached as links. There's the typical budget unit summary report, and it does have a comparison column to the adopted budget, so you can see that. And some of the big swings that you see, that's going to be because of our adjustment to things being coded under federal funds and/or the compensatory funds that have been finalized. So that's much of the reason for those big swings that you see within there. Additionally, there is a staffing report by bargaining group that is also available. I would just like to note that in the recommendation that is before the board, there is also discussion of the various different assumptions we've made and a discussion of the food service, community service, and debt service information. We are recommending that there is a strong possibility that an amendment to this revised budget may come before you in April, as well as we learn even further information before the end of the school year. So with that, the recommendation that the Board of Education approves the 2021-2022 revised budget, providing all funds revenues of $195,655,474 and all funds expenditures of $195,682,512.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve the recommendation?
So moved.
Moved by Director Miller,
Second.
second by Director Word. Is there any discussion? Director Alt?
Just a clarifying question for my own edification. It's unusual for us to grow our fund balance in years past. And I'm seeing this as an exception based on this past year and everything that happened, right? So it's not anything necessarily, I mean, we obviously changed what we did, but it was in response to the situation.
Right. I think that you're going to, in the peer group that I work within, this question has been asked, and others are experiencing similar. Not everyone has the same level of funding that is available as we may have, nor the same level of needs, right? And in addition, if you even take a look at the state level, that's also some discussion there too as to why a surplus. I think it's very similar reasons. So I think it's very unique for the time that we are within.
Great, thank you.
Any other discussion? Director Miller?
Yeah, just to mention on that, Director Ald, if you look at the federal relief fund summary link that they provided there, we clearly have additional funds that are to be spent. I was a little surprised to see that the window on that goes out as far as 24 on some of those, right?
Correct. Yep.
But I would say that's about when you need to start looking for the shoe to drop next couple of years, because we are obviously artificially propped up significantly, so.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
But Lisa will stay there. So next on our agenda, we have to approve the 2021-2022 transportation addenda with Schmitty & Sons. Lisa.
Thank you. So as this pandemic has resulted in a few days already this year in which we have moved to distance learning, and our current contract does not allow for us to pay or make payment on transportation to the transportation company that is continuing to employ their drivers. This addendum is necessary to allow for the payment to both Schmitty & Sons as well as CST-MN, which is the other firm that delivers mostly special education homeless students, but also some general education. So during the months of November and December, for example, we know we have 3 days each month in which this was the case. So the agreements that you see attached here, the addenda is necessary in order for them to receive payment for those 6 days. We do know that they did continue to pay their drivers, and we also have learned that the guidance also indicates that we need to make sure that transportation continues to be available when we do have those days. And so there is a necessity for us to ensure that that's still available to us. So with that, the addendum to, if I may.
Yeah.
The recommendation is that the Board of Education approves the addenda to the Pupil Transportation Services Agreement with Schmitty & Sons and CST-MN for the months of November 2021 through June 9th of 2022.
Is there a motion to approve the recommendation?
So moved.
Moved by Director Hume,
Second.
Second by Director Alt. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Lisa? So next on our agenda, we have to approve on a second reading basis, new policy 534, school meal policy. And we have Lisa Ryder, Executive Director of Business Services.
Thank you. This policy was reviewed by the Policy Review Committee on December 20th, and some changes were made at that point in time. The first reading was approved by the board on January 13th. However, the cross-references to the policies, they were missed on the first reading, and so we have shown them in red on the attached policy, and that is what has changed.
Do we have a motion to approve this policy, policy 534?
So moved.
Moved by Director Werb,
Second.
second by Director Miller. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Lisa. Next on our agenda is to approve on a first reading basis changes to policies 102, equal educational opportunity, 406, public and private personnel data, and 515, protective and privacy of pupil records. Tonight we have Stacy Silvine, Executive Director of Human Services.
Good evening, Chair Chester, directors. Bringing to you tonight 3 policies on their first review. The policies have gone through the Policy Review Committee on January 18th. The recommendations are for policies 102, which is our equal education opportunity policy, and the next 2 policies deal with public and private data. 406 is specifically dealing with personnel data, while 515 is looking at pupil records. All of the recommendations are coming from MSBA. We did review it. We have no objections and are bringing to you the proposed changes from MSBA for the 3 policies. Would you like me to read the recommendation? Yes. Sure. It's a recommendation that the Board of Education approves on a first reading basis changes to policies 102, equal educational opportunity, 406, public and private personnel data, and 515, protection and privacy of pupil records.
Is there a motion to approve this recommendation? Moved by Director Connor.
Second.
Second by Director Said. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Stacy. Next on our agenda, we have approve on a first reading basis changes to policies 501, school weapons policy, and 503, student attendance. We have Brian Gersich, Assistant Superintendent.
Thank you, Chair Chester and board members. Similar to Executive Director Silvine, these are policies that are coming back, came through the Policy Committee on January 18th. Both are policies that were reviewed actually within the last year, but are coming forward again because Minnesota School Board Association did have some recommended changes. Related to 501 weapons policy, it's all statutory additions. So page 2, that's a statutory verbatim definition of weapons. And on pages 4 and 5, some of the reporting requirements now that exist both to the criminal justice system as well as to the Commissioner of Education. Policy 503 on student attendance comes forward with some editorial changes, but just 2 mentions about essentially making sure that we are granting students the ability to miss activities related to religious occurrences. That already is in practice. There isn't really a change here, and it's also covered under the cross-referenced religion policy. There is a note in there about making sure that we provide annual notice, so we will make sure that that is updated for the fall within our student handbook. So again, nothing really changing in practice, but all coming forward from School Board Association recommendations. So the recommendation is to approve on a first reading basis changes to policy 501, school weapons policy, and 503, student attendance.
Is there a motion to approve the recommendation?
So moved.
Moved by Director Werb. Second by Director Connor. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries unanimously. The last item on our agenda is to approve appointing a board member as a representative to the Burnsville Fire Muster and Community Celebration. And so this is in reference to, in the consent agenda, we have already voted to approve our standard committee assignments and board representation within the community. We do have board members that attend the Burnsville Chamber and like the Minnesota State High School League. And so we were approached with the opportunity to have a board member be a representative on this community event. And so we had discussion at a workshop, and so we're bringing it forward tonight with approving the appointment of a board member as a representative of the Burnsville Fire Muster and Community Celebration. So do I have a motion to approve this appointment and adding to our committee groups?
So moved.
Moved by Director Hume.
Second.
Second by Director Said. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion carries unanimously, so now we will add that appointment. So this concludes the regular portion of our board meeting. We will be adjourning to a workshop about FY23 budget, followed by a closed session. Do I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
Moved by Director Hume, second by Director Miller. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Passes unanimously. We are adjourned. We will take about a 10-minute break, coming back at 8:20 to convene for our workshop. 20, so we will reconvene now as our workshop. We are here to discuss FY23 budget with Lisa Ryder.
Thank you.
Executive Director of Business.
There we go. Okay, so the workshop today will be regarding our fiscal year 23 budget. And when developing a budget, the first thing we need to do is start with a plan. So as you see tonight, we're going to discuss the guiding change that we have developed for this process, as well as then the process and timeline that we anticipate, and also discuss that current reality, which we touched on in the previous revised budget, but just to make sure that we understand kind of what assumptions that might look like then moving forward, or what things we need to be thinking about. As we get into this, the agenda then will cover those main three things that you see here. And for the guiding change, as we get into this, I just want to pull this up here and spend a little bit of time with this document, simply because it is so, it encompasses quite a bit of information here. Our guiding change documents usually start with a driving question. There are two here. So as we take a look at our 191 strategic roadmap that requires the district optimize our resources for student learning, the first question is, how will the budget for FY23 continue to support our mission and priorities? How will we balance that budget and leverage every funding source available? And then secondly, how does the budget align with the goals of advancing equitable student outcomes and the district's strategic directions? So as we take a look at this information and we slide down a little bit further down here, I would like to just talk about, there's typically three categories here that we discuss when we talk about guiding change. First is the current reality. Second is, what is it that is not acceptable? What can we not do? And then lastly, what is the desired results, okay? So we did take our preliminary guiding change for feedback with our administrative team, and a couple of things were brought forward and two modifications were made. So under the current reality column, number 2 was added, or I should say rephrased. We do have a virtual academy that was launched in FY22, and that assessment is in process. So they modified the language there a bit to reflect our current reality. And then second change that was made was also in the, it's in the desired results column, the what, and number 3 was added, where it says the outcome of the budget process will result in a budget with competitive class sizes and programs for our students. So those are the two modifications we made from our preliminary adjustments, along with some language that we had already identified as being struck, as it was no longer relating to the current process and moving forward. A couple things I'd like to point out as we go through this. For the current reality, our pre-K pathways development has been identified with a multi-year programmatic investment for full implementation, so that continues to be the case. We talked about our virtual academy. We are projecting a revenue decrease due to enrollment decline in the FY21-22 school year, our current year, and we anticipate that that projection will move forward with a similar result for FY23. We do know that 80% of our costs are salaries and benefits. Our state and federal funding is not keeping pace with our program costs. We know that our general fund, unassigned fund balance policy is 8%. So in a typical year, to ensure that that minimum is met, that's been a struggle for us. Over the last couple of years, some dollars have been flowing down into the unassigned fund balance simply because of the circumstances we're under and the use of federal funds for many of the critical needs that we're doing. It's all about meeting the pandemic needs, right? So it's all eligible under these federal funds that have been received. So therefore, that is something to pay attention to. The thing the budget can be, you can review the budget from two lenses. One, is it a balanced budget? Or two, what is the unassigned fund balance at the end? And depending upon which way you look at it, you can come up with different results. So the guidance we need, will be which way is it that for when we build FY23, which path will we go, right? Balanced budget, or will we utilize some of that fund balance? We do anticipate the budget forecasts will be a surplus as a result of relief funds, and we won't know that for sure until the end of February, okay? We have received significant funds that do run through fiscal year '24, and we are prepared to, we believe we need to prepare for a balanced budget without those federal funds. As has been indicated, that is a significant portion of our expenditures at this moment. And so what will we do when the federal funds are no longer there? That's the key, right? We're seeking legislation to allow us also to maximize the use of property sale proceeds in the general fund. So that's also listed as a current reality. Our formula allowance has been increased, and we plan for that 2% increase that's already been defined by the legislature for next year. We also know that our English learners are really only funded for 4 years, and we have a number of students who we are serving 7 years. So that is something to consider as well. Our voluntary pre-K and school readiness, mostly for us, it's the voluntary pre-kindergarten. This has been extended to 2023. The challenge for us is when we closed our 2 schools, those seats were essentially lost until others can give it up and we can capture those excess seats. So we're in a transition process there. But we're working through that appeal with the state. I should say application process. As well, school districts are required to develop teacher mentoring programs and to use staff development revenue for that purpose. So those are the current realities. As you take a look at that, which is not acceptable as we build next year's budget, can't violate laws, contracts, or agreements, right? We also want to make sure we are not continuing to fund initiatives or programs that do not support our world's best workforce, our achievement and integration plan, or our pre-K-12 pathways and other district priorities. It's not acceptable for us to not complete an annual programmatic site department level line item review of our actual expenditures to make the necessary adjustments as we move along each year. It is not acceptable for us to invest short-term in programs that we know are going to result in a long-term further deficit. Developing a budget that creates greater systemic inequities is not acceptable either. Failing to involve multiple voices in the process, unacceptable. Failure to systemically and thoroughly review the budget for adjustments isn't acceptable. So as we take a look then at the desired results on the last column, we're looking to align to the strategic plan initiatives and equity goals. We want the budget to be designed to retain and recruit students. We want, as was added by our admin team, to have a budget that is competitive class sizes and programs for our students, structurally balanced in projected revenues equaling the projected expenditures. We want to maintain a budget that follows board fund balance policy. And in addition, the rationale used to define the level of acceptable use of fund balance, that mechanism of ensuring that we have a means to replenish that fund balance, use restricted funds first, that kind of thing. We want a result that is a budget built to increase cross-departmental collaboration. We find that very important. Built-in transparent budget process where we can include constituents' perspectives and input. And lastly, it has to be approved by the school board by June 30th of 2022. This is the guiding change document as it is at this point. And I just, I think that the process that has been managed thus far has essentially updated for the current year assumptions and what we know to be true, but has also involved some nice input from other stakeholders within our organization. So that's been a good thing for us to do. Next.
Good question. Can we ask questions along
Yeah,
the way?
I think I would like that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Can you clarify define what competitive class sizes means?
Gonna go there. I was gonna go there.
Yes. Well, I wish I could tell you exactly what that means, but, you know, I think the challenge for us is we know that when you are in the environment in which we're in, we want to recruit those students. And so competitive class sizes also needs to be considered in that process. It's not just the programming, but it's also about what kind of ratios do we have where our students are getting that attention then from teachers as well. And how does that compare to those around us that students might otherwise choose?
And so, in terms of budget, obviously, what kind of investments are needed versus what kinds of reductions?
Right, that balance of.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Along those lines, though, keeping in mind with what we had heard about staff mental health and competitive class sizes, is that something we're looking at differently for, in order to be able to support our staff who have this added secondary trauma?
So I think that much of the challenge, you can have dollars available for addressing the needs of our students. But if you don't have the staff available, it's hard to utilize those dollars as well, right?
Yeah.
So there's just so many factors. This is a very complex environment we're in at this point in time. And so many of our current funds have been utilized for addressing additional staff with additional federal funds, right, that show on that additional row, right? So that we can have additional supports at different grade levels. And the use of the funds for that purpose, I think, is a very widespread use of the federal funds across the state, and seems to be one method of trying to relieve some of that added pressure.
And this competitive class sizes, that all goes by grade level and the subject, right, too? I guess.
Could very well. I mean, here's the thing, that phrase can be interpreted in many different ways. And so I think it's for us to determine what that really needs to look like in the end when we approve our budget.
So that'll be something that we'll be discussing as, you know, as part of the budget process explicitly. Okay.
And I think making sure that we're in sync and as to exactly what that interpretation is important.
Yeah, we work off the same definition.
But to clarify, we're talking about the application of a standing board direction on class size, which is, of course, a very high-level aggregate measure, right? I believe it's 24 and a half at the primary, right? So you're
24 and a
talking
half,
about
yes.
discussing the application of that, right? And
That, as well as potentially, as we did for the 2022 year, you know, where might we utilize these excess funds for something that might be felt to be needed to be targeted specifically for a short period of time?
Okay, I just want to be clear, we have standing board direction, we, you know, of course, how we apply that is open for discussion in the confines of the budget discussion. If we were to change that actual structure altogether, that would need to be something in addition to the budget discussion. So,
Or it would be supplemental, defining, okay, what's it going to cost to add 0.5 at each of the different levels? Yeah, which is what we've done in the past, yeah, yeah.
So that's one of the assumptions that you will see us having, you know, bringing forward and describing exactly what we're starting with, right? And then what needs to be modified from there is what the discussion will be.
I think my only other comment is that I appreciate that we are going to budget as if we don't have federal support, so that we're not trying to count on something that's only temporary.
Any further?
No, continue, thank you.
So I'm going to move back over then to the PowerPoint. Let's see. Oops. Okay. So next slide. There we go. Budget process and timeline. As we go ahead and click on this link, you will find that there is a document that is tried to be very succinct about what it is that we would be finding ourselves working on each month and what that kind of looks like. So this is our plan at this moment. You can see what has been done in November and December. In January, presenting the revised budget occurred tonight. That has enrollment adjustments and revenue and expenditure adjustments for the current year, which are necessary for us to be able to roll things forward and then make adjustments to that in order to bring you a preliminary anticipated current reality for you to kind of understand what that looks like if we do nothing. Does that make sense? We do know that in February then, there are going to be assumptions that need to be shared as to what is it that we utilized in bringing forward those preliminary numbers. And those assumptions then will keep in mind the guiding change that we just walked through. Additionally, there is an intention that at the February 24th in a workshop environment, we would have further discussion of adjustments, and at that point in time, an online feedback would also be made available for the public. Our intention is to attempt to involve more of our community by having a virtual meeting in which we would conduct some opportunities for not only our public but also our staff to see the virtual meeting where we share out the information, and that allows them then also to have the link to how they might be able to participate and respond, and it can be managed without needing to be there in person. We have found that a number of our efforts have resulted in larger participation if it's virtual at this time. In March, there would be planned for some workshops additionally, and the superintendent to present the adjusted budget recommendation to the board with a final draft of that budget presented to the Board of Education during the March workshop. This would not be a line item, but instead the planned assumptions and any adjustments then to that. In April, that's the month in which HR, Human Resources, presents staffing resolutions based upon the various different assumptions, and board action is taken on those. But it is not until June in which the board will receive that line item detailed budget for approval of the final total revenues and total expenditures at the second meeting, with a presentation at the first meeting in June.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
With regard to the online form, and in keeping with wanting to keep multiple voices included in the process, there is a discrepancy between the board planning document. The board planning document had indicated that the online form would open in January with a clear end date identified for families to understand the time frame.
Right. But it will be February before the board has any of that preliminary information, so I'm not sure what the public could report on prior to that being available.
Well, I think there are opinions out there that might be shared, independent of whatever information is presented.
I see.
I think it's definitely helpful, obviously, to have the data and the information for families to have input on, but I think the intention when the board reviewed this document was we want to give people as much time as we can to provide their input, and simply in the month of February may not be adequate. So I would reference back to the board planning document on that.
I'm not sure I completely agree that just opening up a form and saying, give us your 2 cents on budget ideas is going to be completely constructive. I do think people need some boundaries in which they are operating in, understanding. It could be as structural as some of the presentations we saw tonight, with where funding comes from and where it goes out, so at least set some boundaries up. But I think our staff might find themselves reading some stuff that's rather uninformed if we just open up a form and say, give us your 2 cents about everything.
And I think that's a good point, Eric. I definitely agree with that. I think we have information that's been presented tonight that people could provide feedback on.
So maybe at least direction back to, kind of where we're at with the budget to date. If you don't have it forward-looking, at least current budget status. Such would be
I don't want to get into the details of it because that's, that's for you guys to figure out. But I'm sure there's something that you can come up with that would allow the board to, and families to, share their input now. And then the other point too, again, referencing back to the board planning document, the board planning document does not mention 2 workshops. The board planning document mentions, let's see, in March, first March regular board meeting, present final budget adjustments to the board, and then there's a board workshop to review input and feedback. Then at the second meeting, not a workshop, second meeting of the board is when you present the final adjustments by department based on input. And I think there's an important distinction to be made there in terms of presenting the official final budget within a regular board meeting as opposed to within a workshop, which might lead people to believe that there's additional work that might have to happen after the workshop. And we know that that's just not the case. So I would, again, reference back to the board planning document, that the final budget is presented in a regular board meeting.
I believe it's final adjustments, right? I mean, the final budget won't come until June.
Correct,
Okay.
yes, yeah, the final adjustments, right. They would be presented, the clarification is the location in a regular board meeting as opposed to a workshop. And that's it for now.
For the virtual community input, are we going to be able to have, like if we have our community members where English isn't their first language, needing interpreters or being able to speak, is there going to be that available so that it's more accessible for everybody?
That's a very good point. Having it actually voiced over or presented in another language is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Or being able to have that correspondence or dialogue.
Okay. Anything else?
Nope, continue.
Okay, then I will move back into the PowerPoint. And so with regard to assumptions, the enrollment that is assumed for FY23 at this time will be K-12. This is not pre-K-12, but K-12, 7,219. We will use the same figure for fall and end of year. Our further assumptions that we typically have will all be included then in the projection models that you see in February. At this point in time, our current reality starts with that revised budget that you've now approved tonight. So with this approval, then we will be able to move forward in placing it into our system, being able to move that into our projection model, and from there then roll this forward for a preliminary budget that we can bring forward at our next meeting and have that kind of shared and understood as to what that may look like. We do know, we've been through this slide quite extensively in the revised budget, so I'm not certain if you have other questions before I move on from this slide. But we do know that as we roll this forward and you see the 22-23 year, that our ESSER 2 funds that we talked about, that $7,177,000, we expect is going to be fully spent in 22. For 23 and for 24, we are assuming that we're going to take the ESSER 3 funds that we have available to us and basically split that in half and use 50% each year. The funds that you see in all the list of other grants that are included in our revised budget currently, we will not include them in any way, shape, or form for the adopted budget for next year. And instead, any carryover that exists after the audit is complete, that would then roll into the next fiscal year 23 budget as a revision, okay? So that's kind of how that typically works for our federal funds. Because federal funds, you receive only after you spend. So we have to show evidence of that expenditure before we receive the funds, okay? As we take a look at, we've been through this slide. I just felt it was important to continue because this is really going to be the crux of our issue moving forward. And with that is this explanation, right? And helping people to understand that. Because what is so concerning to me is when I hear the conversation around a 2% increase on revenue, and yet I know that our expenditures, just because of inflation, increase well beyond that, and that our expenditure percentage is attached to the entire amount of expenditures, right? Whereas the percentage increase on the gen ed formula is only, as we see, 41.6% of our revised budget. So that's a challenge for us because no matter what, even with exactly the same enrollment, you still have a gap. And so that's going to be a challenge that we have to always have to consider. For the timeline then, let's see. We have tonight revised budget, February 24th, preliminary list of budget adjustments in workshop. I believe that's still accurate, right? February virtual meetings and presentations seeking input and feedback. And I'm hearing to improve upon that with January opportunity as well. March 10th, superintendent presents recommended budget adjustments at workshop. That's still accurate, right? And gather feedback from parents and community after the March 10th board meeting. So we would continue to seek that after your conversation. And then again, the June adoption. Okay. Our next steps, as I said, you've approved the FY22 budget revised. I kind of talked about this where we have to get this into our systems, roll everything forward, and then determine that level of budget adjustments that are going to be required. Are we balancing the budget? Revenues equal to expenditures? Are we utilizing some of the fund balance? How much of the federal funds would be used to offset? Those are some of the key questions that are somewhat unique to our environment currently as well. And that concludes the presentation I have for you in the workshop tonight.
Any other questions, discussion? I'll be interested to know, because we were presented with the kindergarten or pre-K information, how much that might translate or be in the assumptions or proposed going into the next fiscal year too. Knowing that we have that percentage of like 75% move to enrollment, if that stays on trend or not, those kind of factors. I like data, so there's something interesting because I don't know if that could be a marker that we
start tracking and keeping track of. That kindergarten number is tricky.
Yeah.
Yep.
I would be a little, obviously given the environment and externalities involved with that right now. Pre-K is a very voluntary thing, right? So in today's COVID world, I question how much impact on those numbers is caused by that. So, which is still be there 2 years from now, unfortunately, we'll see.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
So that concludes our workshop tonight. We will move to our closed session. So we will need to go off air and